The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager, your host for the show. Theater history is a fascinating subject that sits right at the intersection of a whole range of disciplines. It provides unique insight into how people have entertained themselves, how they've tried to make sense of their world through art, and the ways in which they've done so in the context of live performance. But there's a hitch with that phrase, live performance, and it's one that makes the subject of theater history especially tricky. With most forms of art, there's some sort of way to experience the thing itself. You can always find a way to watch a classic movie, or go see a famous work of visual art in a museum. But when theater happens, that's it, the moment's over. It's gone. Sure, today you can record a performance on film, and, as we're probably going to discuss a whole bunch of times on this podcast, there are all sorts of traces of performance that remain. Written, visual records, other ways that we can try to recreate the experience of seeing something live. But you can't ever fully recreate that experience. You can't ever really grasp what it was like to see something incredible or awful or weird happen in your presence. So, how can we better understand the history of the theater? And why should we? What's so important about doing that anyways? If we can recover the past, how can it help to inform what we do as artists? How can it lead to the creation of new works of theater? Those are the big picture questions that are always going to be lurking in the background of this podcast. But it's not always going to be focused on those big, serious questions. I want it to be fascinating and surprising and informative and just plain fun. The plan is for most episodes to feature a conversation with a guest about a single major topic, one story or one especially interesting concept from the history of the theater. I also want to say that this is a show that's meant for everyone with an interest in theater, or even just history in general. You don't need any sort of specialized knowledge to follow along. I'm not going to go in assuming that you know all about Balinese dance or David Garrick, but hopefully you and I can learn about those and many other subjects together as we go along. A little bit about me, just in case you're wondering. I've got a PhD in drama from Tufts University, and I currently teach at Emerson College in Boston. I also run a Twitter account on theater history, @theaterhistory, and theater there is spelled Theater. I'm really eager to get to share fascinating stories from theater history with you, and I hope you enjoy listening to the podcast as much as I'll enjoy creating it. Please feel free to give me feedback by getting in touch with me through the Twitter account. Again, that's @theaterhistory. And happy listening. All right, for today's episode, I'm talking to Max Shulman. He's an assistant professor of theater at the University of Colorado Springs. And we're here to talk about drugs today.
That's right. That's what I do. I talk about drugs.
Specifically a play called Madame X, which was a big deal about a century ago.
That's right. Yeah. Madame X by Alexandre Bizon. So originally a French play called La Femme X. But exactly, we're going to talk about drugs and Madame X.
So when did this play emerge? What is the background to it?
Right, sure. Yeah, so this is one of these great plays that that we've sort of lost. Nobody writes about it, nobody talks about it, nobody knows about it. But it was a huge deal. It premiered in France in 1909, and then almost immediately afterwards premiered in America. So 1909, right in the heart of what we think of as the Progressive Era. And it was wildly famous. I would go so far as to sort of call it a cultural phenomenon. I mean, it was embedded in the way people think. Everybody would have heard of it. And it was one of these towering melodramas. One of the sort of, in some ways, one of the ones that showed up right before the kind of arrival of American realism with the Provincetown Players and O'Neill and things like that. So one of these last really big dominating melodramas. And it was popular not just in 1909. I mean, it was the play of the season, but it was reproduced endlessly and was then they started making movies of it. There have been about a dozen versions of Madame X turned into movies. The last one being in 1965 with Lana Turner and Burgess Meredith. So this play had serious legacy. And now it's totally forgotten.
Yeah, it's sort of striking how quickly it's disappeared after, fairly recently, 1965 is not that long ago. And dozens of a dozen at least film adaptations, you said.
Yeah, including silent adaptations with all types of famous people sort of scattered throughout in multiple languages and things like that. Yeah, and this is one of the theater historians very often miss the popular. We talk about the subversive and the avant-garde, and we kind of miss what culture is actually paying attention to, which is a play like Madame X that was wildly popular in 1909, but that fits a kind of. It doesn't subvert at all. It's a play that plays exactly into the sort of dominant norms of the period.
Well, can you maybe sort of walk us through the plot of the play a little bit?
Yeah. So now even in its American adaptation, it was set in France. So it's always set in France. They don't change the names. They don't change the location, and that's kind of important when we think about its social value, which you can talk about later. But so Madame X begins with a prologue, in which Jacqueline, I'm just going to say the English version. Jacqueline is a beautiful middle-class housewife who has left her husband for another. She has cheated on her husband, and she is coming back after she realizes that the affair was a mistake. She comes back to ask for forgiveness. Her little son Raymond, who she has not seen, he is ill, and she begs to see him and to be let back into her life. She begs for forgiveness, and her husband Fleurot says no, and he casts her out into the streets of Bordeaux, or I guess the streets of Paris. That's right. So casts her out into the streets of Paris. That's the prologue. Act 1 begins 20 years later. And Jacqueline arrives now in Bordeaux. She just shows up in Bordeaux. And for the last 20 years, she has abused herself. She has fallen into total degradation, using drugs and especially using drugs. It's really a focus on the fact that she has become an addict, and she is worn and dissipated and sort of on her last legs.
And if I can interrupt for a second, you said this is maybe one of the few uses of ether as the sort of drug of choice.
Right. So they talk about how she was found in Buenos Aires in an opium den using morphine and laudanum. But in the play itself, in the action of the play itself, she drinks ether. That's her drug of choice, which is a really weird drug of choice. And she may actually be the only ether addict ever on stage. Ether was not a problem in Paris, nor was it a problem in the U.S. And its kind of mystery is maybe part of the intrigue. But throughout, if you see all the pictures from all the publicity pictures have her holding a little clear bottle of ether. You would have drunk it in little sips, and it got you hot. So she's an ether addict,
and this is toned down. By the time we get to like the Lana Turner film version, she's just a drunk, right? They have to kind of play down some of that edgier stuff.
That's right. So by the time we get to 1965, and even long before that, by the time we get into the 30s and the production code is on, the production code in America specifically says you cannot show drug addiction. You cannot show the use of drugs. And so in those later movies, she's just a drunk. And in the Lana Turner version, there's mention of her liking absinthe. And, absinthe at the time had the notoriety that it was hallucinogenic and did crazy things to you. So they just sort of plug in whatever weird thing they can find that might explain what happens.
Absinthe is about the worst thing that people were doing in the 60s.
That's right. Can you imagine? Right. So what happens is, so she's in Bordeaux, she's fallen apart, she's on her last legs, and she's got this new boyfriend, this kind of petty criminal con man named LaRocque. And she finds out that LaRocque he's found out about her past, and he's going to use the knowledge of her past to extort money from Fleurot. He's going to extort her original dowry from Fleurot. Now she gets very angry about this because, one, she doesn't want Fleurot to know she's still alive, but most importantly is she wants to keep news of herself and her present state away from her son Raymond. She does not want her mistakes in life and her horrible status in life to affect him, because she knows that if somebody finds out that his mother is a degenerate drug addict, it will affect him poorly. So Fleurot threatens to extort. Leroc threatens to extort Fleurot. She, in an ether-inspired madness, shoots Leroc and kills him in order to protect her child. Then comes the famous trial. So she's put up on trial for murder. She refuses to say anything. She doesn't even say her name. And so she is called Madame X in the newspapers and in trial. That's how they refer to her. She refuses to say a thing because she doesn't want her name or news of her to get back to her son. She's put up on trial, and what she realizes halfway through the trial is that she is being defended by none other than Raymond, her own son. This is that kind of melodramatic, coincidental action you would never see beyond this, right? So her own son is going to be her defending attorney. She still won't say anything. He, in a very famous trial scene, gives this rousing, heartwarming speech about who this woman is and defending her. And in the end, she is found innocent of her crime. And in the final moment, her identity is revealed. She has a moment of salvation and redemption with her son and her husband. But the strain has been too much. And so in classic melodramatic fashion, she dies. And that is how the play ends, with her forgiveness and death.
And presumably a very dramatic, arresting tableau for that final moment as the curtain comes down.
Oh, gosh. The play, and all the reviews of the play, all they talk about is how it is designed to wring tears from its audience. No matter what gender, age, or class, you will weep your eyes out when seeing Madame X.
And you make a point about this, that this is kind of part of this larger trope of this adulterous, abandoned mother figure who screws everything up, but then kind of is redeemed and then very conveniently dies at the end of the play.
So this is already a trope of the mother who has screwed everything up and then dies at the end with redemption. So plays like East Lynne, the famous line, dead, and never called me mother. In France, a play called Frou Frou. But then also these other famous women, Camille, Marguerite Gautier, Phaedra, these women who do wrong, and at the very end, through sacrifice, they reach redemption, but that they die at the very end. And I always talk to my students about, they have to die because at this point in time, we can forgive these fallen women, but we can't then have them back in society, right? We can give them salvation and forgiveness, but they can't then show up to tea at our house. We haven't figured out how to do that yet. Right? They can't re-enter back into society, even if they do gain forgiveness from that society. So like all others, these women have to die.
And it's interesting that you say that, because this is about 4 years, when this runs, at least in the United States, it's about 4 years after they've shut down a production of Mrs. Warren's Profession, right. Yes?
Yes, that's exactly right. And there's even mention of that Madame X Madame X it sort of fits the niche perfectly. It is tailored to show you some degradation, but not to upset the status quo. Madame X, Mrs. Warren's Profession really upset the standard, because it claimed and made legitimate things that we weren't ready to hear. But Madame X does this great job of kind of just skirting the dangerous without troubling anything really. And so that's part of why it did so well.
And it's actually, I think it's roughly contemporary with another play that might be a little bit better known, Clyde Fitch's The City.
Right. Yeah.
Which also kind of deals with that. In that case, and maybe we can go into this a bit, sure. You have a male drug user, right. Which is, as you say, more typical of what you'd expect to see right. In that sort of style of melodrama.
That's right, yeah, because you really don't see a lot of female addicts until Fitch's play comes out in 1909 as well, and there's actually this explosion of drug plays in 1909. There's a bunch all of a sudden. Most of the time, we don't get to see women addicts. Fitch's play is famous because, one, Clyde Fitch was a really famous writer, probably the most famous American writer at the time, one of them. It's his last play. He dies right before it opens. And he gives us our first white male addict who is a villain. Up until then, the villains who were also drug addicts were all Chinese opium smokers. So Fitch is the first guy to sort of say, well, this is a sign of criminality. Let's use this to create a bad guy. And he uses this drug addict. And we get little hints of redemption, but in the end, the drug addict is sort of a criminal madman who needs to be incarcerated. This is certainly maybe the first time we get a drug addict who we need, and this is what's important when we think about the larger social element. Jacqueline is a drug addict who redeems herself. And that really plays into some important questions from my perspective, because drug addiction seemed to present the limits of salvation during this period. It was the limits of the imagination for how low a person could go, right? Madame X is not about drug addiction. Madame X is a play that uses drug addiction, and it uses it to signal how low a person can go. Jacqueline's drug addiction signals that she is totally degraded. She's degenerated. But what's key is that her maternal instinct remains, so that a mother, even at the lowest of the low, will still care for her child, that she would still be driven by that. So that drug addiction is being used as a device here within a melodramatic sort of scheme.
And one of the ways, not that this play sounds like it necessarily needed it, but one of the ways to get even more attention to it is to cast a big star in the main role. Right.
Well, this is what's sort of interesting. The woman who got famous doing the play was this woman, Dorothy Donnelly. She wasn't famous beforehand. This was her breakout role. But the person who was famous who did this was, and again, to add to the kind of cultural phenomenon of this play, is that it became a regular role for Sarah Bernhardt. And in fact, Bernhardt was given special permission while in America. She was in America while Donnelly was performing in 1909. The producer gave Bernhardt special permission to perform the play. And she did. And in fact, they even performed a special performance so that Donnelly's company could come and see her do it. And it was like, all the reviews are amazing. It's, Bernhardt creates the histrionics that no American actress could reach, so gut-wrenchingly dramatic and emotionally moving that like the world has never seen. That was what this role provided. And really, especially in the trial scene. And here, there's a funny story when we think about the difference between actors then and actors now, that I found in an article where if you paid extra, you could go and actually sit in the gallery on stage during the trial scene. You could be like within the courtroom scene if you paid extra.
Immersive theater.
Yes, immersive theater. That's right, on stage. And the reports were that during Bernhardt's performances, she, in order to hide her face as Madame X, she would wrap her face in this brown shawl, like a silk brown shawl, which is funny to think of. You would never see someone do that today. She couldn't see her face, and she would perform the kind of melodramatic heavings and weepings and sighings just with her body, so her shoulders and her back, and but that if you were on stage close enough to her and listened really carefully, while she was in the height of hysterics, weeping and crying and her body shaking, she would be making fun of the play to her other actors in French. She would be whispering to the other actors little funny things while she was doing it. So you have to think about, when we think about method acting today, the idea of, immersion in the character, being the part. This is totally distant from that, right? Bernhardt was offering a completely measured and sort of carefully crafted, choreographed performance of this dramatic part. But she by no means was feeling the emotions that Madame X was feeling. It's a really funny difference to think about.
Well, and it's striking, too, because Dorothy Donnelly, who you mentioned, kind of goes for the opposite effect in a way. Or at least gives the illusion that she's doing this as realistically as possible.
That's right, yeah. So Donnelly went to sanatoriums and saw addicts and advertised this widely. And so then there's a perception that Donnelly is an expert on addiction. And so she starts, really this is press stuff for the play, But she starts writing these articles that end up in major newspapers, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, where she talks about where she sort of serves as an expert on addiction, and she talks about here are the stages of addiction. And there are even in these articles, there are pictures of her in costume and makeup, assuming the positions of the phases of addiction that she falls into. And, there are phases like dreams and defiance and despair, ending in tragic grief. And it is in the state of tragic grief which all addicts go through that she shoots Larocque, that she kills this man. And so what you get, exactly what you're talking about, is that she is kind of declaring not that, here is a representation of addiction, but here is a kind of empiric, scientifically designed a portrayal of addiction. It is not a version of, but kind of an actuality. And it's interesting when you think about, we're just coming out of, or they've experienced naturalism, which exactly is that. It's an attempt for a scientific, you put reality on stage through scientific observation. Well, that's what Donnelly is doing.
And in the context of this very sort of artificial melodrama, the sort of thing that even Bernhardt is kind of making fun of.
It's a great point, right? So you have to unpack this idea. She's claiming this is science on stage. I am showing you the true reality of addiction, but you have to remember it's all about the conventions and structures of melodrama. Bizon wrote a play within a genre that has a particular arc. He created a play in which he wanted to demonstrate the resilience of motherhood, in which a woman has to sin and then be redeemed at the end. So he has to create a proper character arc in order for that melodramatic moral to come across. And in order to do that, he has to fit her addiction into that. And so, Donnelly's not showing any sort of natural reality of addiction. She's showing a melodramatic construct, addiction turned into a trope. Is what she's really showing us. And that really plays into some of the larger social elements that this play, I think, is important. This is the progressive era. This is the period during which, at least for drug addiction, the policies, it's the first time we get a federal drug law. It's at the period at which these policies are going into shape, at which the images of addiction that this country still today kind of maintains are being set in stone, and the rhetoric of what a drug scare is, what a drug addict looks like, is all being formulated, and it influences. When you think to yourself, really, what my research is, and it's not a new idea, but that is trying to examine how representation influences our perception on a larger social scale, how it influences policy, how it influences how we imagine things. And so, when you think about a drug addict in your head, then the vision that pops in your head, that, at least as I see it, is very often influenced by our performances. And in this case is no less. And maybe in the most important period it could be, because in 1909, that is when we start debating what are we going to do about our drug addicts. And in 1914, we get our first federal drug law with the Harrison Act. And in 1919, we get a reinterpretation of that act. And it's in this progressive era that we get the kind of criminalization of addiction, and we get the rhetoric of addiction. And it is a rhetoric that has to do with class and gender and race. And so that's in why this kind of giant popular melodrama that seems to be so easily forgotten, that's why it's important, because it formulates these ideas.
And what about it sort of in terms of parallels to today? Because it's interesting. It's almost a century apart from where we are now.
Right.
And it really sort of feels in a weird way like it mirrors, or should we even say rhymes with, kind of what the debate is currently over drug policy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what we're seeing today is we're seeing really since the Harrison Act of 1914, we're seeing the first scaling back of drug legislation with things like what they're doing with marijuana in certain places. We're seeing the first sort of move away from what becomes these mandatory minimums. So we're seeing the first turn away from this first, the criminalization of addiction, in some of the first instances. What I think Donnelly plays a role in, and that still is present today, is who gets to say who is an addict? What addict is worthy of forgiveness? What addict can attain forgiveness? What kind of addict is a patient who is suffering from a disease, a victim? And what addicts are criminal, vice-ridden people? Donnelly's play or Bizon's play, Madame X, sets in stone the concept that the white, female, middle-class addict is capable of redemption. She is capable of cure and redemption. Now, again, she has to die at the end, but she is. That kind of narrative is not extended to figures like African Americans, to the Chinese, to lower class urban men. It's not a narrative that is provided for them. And so the rhetoric, it reflects and helps create the rhetoric of the period that still exists today. Right. In that same period, we have people claiming things like the real fear about drugs is that, yes, people like the middle class bourgeois housewife might fall, but the further danger is that, and you should see some of these articles that are printed in things like the New York Times saying things like cocaine use by African Americans makes them super strong, super aggressive, and invites them essentially towards either cannibalism or the rape of white women. Right.
Oh my God.
African Americans are not provided the kind of narrative where they get representation. These same narratives continue today. So this was about cocaine. There was just not long ago when PCP first came on the scene, almost an identical article was printed that kind of said PCP it makes you super strong. It makes you kind of animalistic and cannibalistic, and it makes you sexually aggressive. So what we get is that during these drug scares, certain populations are always whatever stereotypes always exist. They're going to be exacerbated by drug use. Today we're dealing more with African Americans because there's still a remnant from the crack epidemic, but now we're dealing with essentially what happens when white trash people do methamphetamines. Right. It's still an underprivileged society that is not given access to a kind of narrative where they get redemption and healing. Where when you think about our plays and movies about drug addiction that get to redeem themselves, well, it's not those. So Donnelly and Bizon and Madame X are starting. That's where this process starts.
Thank you so much for being on the show, for agreeing to be a guest.
Okay, Mike.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.